Imagine trying to reconstruct someone's entire life without a single word they ever wrote or spoke. No diaries, no letters, no names, just the objects they left behind, the shape of their bones, the faint chemical traces in their teeth. Now scale that challenge across an entire continent and stretch it back hundreds of thousands of years. That is exactly what we're attempting when we study prehistoric Europe, and somehow, against all odds, we're actually pulling it off. Before the first alphabet scratched into clay, before the first chronicle or inscription, Europe was already ancient. Deeply, almost incomprehensibly ancient. The story we're about to tell spans something in the range of 1,000,000 years, from the earliest human footprints on European soil to the point where scattered written records finally begin to catch the edges of real civilizations. Everything in between belongs to prehistory, a vast, largely silent world that we can only read through what people made, built, buried, and left behind. The evidence we work with is powerful but fragmentary. A jawbone eroding out of a Spanish hillside. Stone tools buried under meters of sediment in a river valley. The ruins of a massive megalithic tomb aligned to catch the light of the winter solstice. Ancient DNA extracted from a tooth, carrying genetic echoes of migrations that happened long before anyone could record them. Each piece of evidence tells part of a story, but no single piece tells the whole thing, and that incompleteness is something we have to sit with honestly. Prehistorians debate constantly about dates, about interpretations, about what the physical record actually means. Where genuine uncertainty exists, we'll say so, because the best history doesn't hide the gaps. So what are the big questions driving this story? Who actually lived in Europe across these deep stretches of time, and where did they come from? How did people survive in environments that ranged from frozen tundra to dense forest to sun-baked coastlines? How did they organize themselves, feed themselves, make sense of the world around them? And how did Europe keep transforming, not just geographically as ice sheets advanced and retreated, but culturally as new technologies, new ideas, and new peoples arrived in wave after wave? Because that is one of the most striking things about prehistoric Europe. It was never static. It was a continent in constant motion. Populations moved, mixed, and sometimes disappeared entirely. New species of humans arrived, coexisted with older ones, and eventually gave way to others. Farming spread across the continent over thousands of years, reshaping landscapes and societies in ways that still echo today. Metals changed the balance of power. Trade networks connected communities, separated by hundreds of kilometers. And at certain moments, people gathered enormous collective effort to build monuments, stone circles, burial mounds, hill forts that point toward belief systems and social structures far more complex than we might expect from people we sometimes casually call prehistoric. This is a story of migrations and extinctions, of inventions that spread across continents, of beliefs powerful enough to move megaton slabs of stone. It is a story told almost entirely through physical traces, interpreted by scientists and scholars who are still actively debating what those traces mean. There are no names in this story, no individual voices, but there are people fully human, endlessly resourceful, navigating a world we can barely imagine. And their story is worth telling in full. The question of when humans first set foot in Europe turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer, and the closer scientists look, the more complicated the picture becomes. For a long time, the working assumption was that hominins arrived in Europe somewhere around 500,000 years ago, give or take. Then excavations started turning up evidence that pushed that date back further. And then further still today, Some of the most provocative findings suggest that human relatives may have been present in parts of Europe well over 1 million years ago, possibly closer to 1.4 million years. But here's the catch: the older the evidence, the harder it is to interpret with confidence. A handful of stone tools found in an ancient riverbed could represent a brief, failed incursion that left no lasting population. A fragment of bone might be misidentified, or contaminated, or simply impossible to date with precision using current methods. So when we talk about the first humans in Europe, we're really talking about a blurry frontier, not a clean arrival date. What we can say with more confidence is that these early migrants were not Homo sapiens, not our species. They belonged to earlier branches of the human family tree, sometimes grouped under the loose label of archaic hominins, making their way westward out of Africa and through the Middle East and into the fringes of a continent that was, by any reasonable measure, not especially welcoming. One of the most remarkable windows into this early chapter comes from northern Spain, from a limestone ridge called the Sierra de Atapuerca. The site has been producing extraordinary findings since the 1970s, and it continues to reshape our understanding of early European life. At a location within Atapuerca known as Grandolina, excavators found hominin fossils and stone tools in sediments that have been dated to roughly 850,000 years ago. The species represented there has been tentatively named Homo antecessor, and while debate continues about exactly how it relates to later human lineages, the fossils give us something rare and precious, a real glimpse of who these people were. They had faces that showed some surprisingly modern features alongside more archaic characteristics, and the bones show cut marks, suggesting that these individuals were processed, possibly cannibalized, which tells us something startling about behavior in this deep past, even if we're careful not to overinterpret a handful of specimens. Atapuerca keeps giving. Another part of the site, the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, contains the remains of at least 28 individuals deposited in a cave shaft around 430,000 years ago. Who these people were, and why their remains ended up at the bottom of a pit, remains genuinely mysterious. Some researchers have suggested it represents an early form of deliberate disposal of the dead, which would have profound implications for questions about cognition and symbolic thought. Others are more cautious, but the sheer number of individuals is remarkable. It's the largest collection of hominin fossils from anywhere in the world for this period, and the bones show these were physically powerful people adapted to cold and demanding environments. Genetically, they appear to be early relatives of the Neanderthals, already beginning to diverge along a distinctly European evolutionary path. And that brings us to one of the most important forces shaping early human life in Europe: climate. Because Europe during this period was not a stable, hospitable landscape. It was a continent caught in the grip of repeated glacial cycles, swinging between long, brutal cold phases and shorter, warmer interglacials. During cold periods, ice sheets advanced from the north, sea levels dropped, and vast stretches of the continent became effectively uninhabitable, open tundra swept by Arctic winds, with the major river systems locked under ice for part of the year. During warmer phases, forests expanded, megafauna moved northward, and the continent briefly became richer and more accessible. What this meant for early hominins was that Europe was not a place you simply arrived and stayed. Populations expanded during warm periods and contracted or disappeared entirely during cold ones. There's genuine evidence suggesting that early human populations in Europe may have been driven to local extinction multiple times, only for new groups to arrive from the south or east when conditions improved. Think of it less as a continuous human presence, and more as a series of pulses, populations advancing and retreating in rhythm with the ice. Surviving in this environment required serious cognitive and behavioral flexibility. And the stone tools these early Europeans made offer us one of our best windows into that cognitive world. The dominant technology across much of this early period is what archaeologists call the Acheulean tradition, named after a site in France, characterized by large, carefully shaped hand axes and cleavers. These tools are not crude. Producing a well-made Acheulean hand axe requires planning, a mental template held in mind before the first strike is made, and real skill developed over years of practice. The fact that this basic technology remained recognizable across vast stretches of time and geography, not just in Europe, but across Africa and Western Asia, is itself remarkable. It speaks to some form of learned, transmitted knowledge, even if we can't say exactly how that transmission worked. But the tools also reveal something about the limits of this early technology. Compared to what comes much later in the human story, Acheulean tools are relatively standardized, relatively unchanging over enormous time spans. There's little of the regional variation and rapid innovation that we associate with later periods. Whether that reflects cognitive limitations, highly stable lifestyles, or simply the conservative transmission of proven techniques, is a live debate. What it suggests, at minimum, is that these were people adapting to Europe's challenges with a reliable but not yet highly flexible technological toolkit. What were they actually doing day to day? We can piece together fragments. They were hunters and scavengers, exploiting large mammals, horses, rhinos, elephants in warmer periods, bison and reindeer in colder ones. Sites with butchered animal bones tell us they were processing carcasses with skill and efficiency. There's evidence at some sites that fire was being used, though the earliest secure evidence for controlled fire use in Europe is a matter of ongoing investigation. The evidence is tantalizing but contested for the earliest periods. They were living in groups almost certainly because solo survival in these environments would have been essentially impossible. They were moving across large territories, following resources through the seasons. But what's striking and worth sitting with honestly is how little we can say about the inner lives of these earliest Europeans. Did they use language? Almost certainly some form of communication, but whether it resembled anything like modern language is deeply unclear. Did they have beliefs about death, about the world, about forces beyond the visible? We genuinely don't know. The Cima de los Huesos hints at something, some behavior around the dead that might carry meaning, but we're working at the edge of what the evidence can tell us. What we can say is this: Europe during this long early chapter was a frontier in the truest sense. It was not a heartland where human populations flourished in stability and built on accumulated tradition across generations. It was a marginal zone, biologically, geographically, climatically, where hominins pushed against the edges of survivability. The same features that would eventually make Europe a remarkable incubator for later cultural complexity. Its varied landscapes, its seasonal rhythms, its unpredictable climate were, for these earliest inhabitants, constant sources of pressure and risk. The populations that managed to persist here were doing something genuinely impressive. They were surviving in an environment that was, for significant stretches of time, genuinely hostile. And in doing so, over hundreds of thousands of years, they were setting a pattern that would define much of what follows in this story. People arriving in Europe, adapting, transforming, and sometimes vanishing, only to be replaced by others who began the cycle again. Europe was not waiting passively for humans to civilize it. It was testing them, selecting for resilience and adaptability in ways that would slowly, over deep time, shape the populations and cultures that emerged. The first Europeans were not settlers laying foundations for a continuous story. They were pioneers in an unstable world, and most of what they built in terms of populations, traditions, and genetic lineages did not survive in any direct sense to reach us today. But they were here, and they were, in every meaningful sense, human relatives navigating real challenges with real intelligence. Their bones and their tools are the first entries in Europe's long record, fragmented, contested, and endlessly fascinating. The story that follows is built on the foundation they unknowingly laid, generation by uncertain generation, in a continent that would take a very long time to feel like home. Out of that long, uncertain early chapter, those first pulses of hominin presence testing the edges of a cold and unpredictable continent, something remarkable began to take shape. A lineage that had been slowly diverging, adapting, being reshaped by hundreds of thousands of years of European conditions, eventually produced one of the most fascinating and persistently misunderstood humans who ever lived, the Neanderthal. Neanderthals didn't appear suddenly. They emerged gradually, over an enormous stretch of time, from ancestral populations already present in Europe, populations like those individuals found in the Cima de los Huesos, whose genetics we now know pointed toward what was coming. By around 400,000 years ago, distinctly Neanderthal features were consolidating. By 250,000 years ago, classic Neanderthals were established across a vast swath of territory stretching from the Atlantic coast of Europe eastward through the Middle East and into Central Asia. They would persist, thriving and adapting, for well over 200,000 years, a run of success that puts our own species' track record firmly in perspective. And the environment that shaped them was brutal by any modern standard. European glacial periods brought temperatures that could drop significantly below anything we experience today across most of the continent. Landscapes shifted from open steppe and tundra to boreal forest and back again within timescales of thousands of years. Megafauna roamed in extraordinary numbers: woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, cave lions, giant deer with antler spans that seem almost impossible. Neanderthals lived among all of this, and not merely as marginal survivors clinging to the edges. They were, by any reasonable assessment, extraordinarily well suited to it. Physically, the evidence for that adaptation is written directly into their bones. Neanderthals were stocky and powerfully built, with shorter limbs relative to their torso compared to modern humans, a body shape that reduces heat loss in cold environments, a pattern seen in other cold-adapted mammals. Their large nasal cavities may have helped warm and humidify frigid air before it reached the lungs. Their bones show evidence of enormous muscle attachment points, suggesting physical strength that would dwarf most modern humans. They were not lumbering brutes. Their skeletons show the kind of musculature associated with constant, demanding physical activity. Hunting large animals at close range in cold conditions, over rough terrain, requires exactly that, and they were hunting large animals, actively, deliberately, and with considerable skill. Isotopic analysis of Neanderthal bones, essentially a chemical record of what they ate, reveals diets dominated by large terrestrial herbivores: bison, horse, reindeer, mammoth. This was not primarily scavenging. Spear points found embedded in animal bones, along with analysis of wear patterns on Neanderthal tools, confirm they were using hafted weapons, thrusting spears most likely at close quarters. That kind of hunting, getting within arm's reach of a bison or a woolly rhinoceros, is not something you do without coordination, communication, and genuine courage. It also doesn't go well without some form of group strategy. Those groups, the social units in which Neanderthals lived, were probably relatively small, perhaps a few dozen individuals at most, with regular contact between neighboring bands. But what we find in the skeletal record tells us something profound about how those groups functioned. Multiple Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of serious injuries, broken bones, joint damage, traumatic wounds that healed over time. Healing from a broken femur or a severe shoulder injury in the Ice Age requires extended care. Someone had to provide food. Someone had to protect and support the injured individual during weeks or months of recovery. The evidence for deliberate care of the injured and elderly is among the most powerful arguments against the old image of Neanderthals as purely brutish and self-interested. These were people who looked after each other. There's more. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, Neanderthal burials, or what appear to be intentional disposals of the dead, have been found. The interpretation of these is genuinely contested. Some researchers argue forcefully that deliberate burial implies symbolic thought, some form of belief system, perhaps even grief. Others point out that the evidence for grave goods and elaborate ritual is much weaker than was once claimed, and that some apparent burials may reflect natural processes. The debate is real and ongoing. But even the conservative reading of the evidence suggests Neanderthals were doing something deliberate with their dead, something that goes beyond simply leaving a body where it fell. And the symbolic behavior doesn't stop there. At several sites, Neanderthals appear to have collected eagle talons and feathers, perforated shells, and used pigments including ochre and black manganese dioxide, materials with no obvious functional purpose. In caves in Spain that have been dated, controversially but with increasing technical confidence, to before the arrival of Homo sapiens in the region, markings and hand stencils have been found that may represent Neanderthal art. The dating of these finds has been disputed and refined repeatedly, and the debate is not entirely settled. But the accumulation of evidence is increasingly difficult to wave away. Whatever model we use to understand Neanderthal cognition has to account for behavior that looks, at minimum, symbolically motivated. Their technology reflected genuine regional variation and real sophistication. The Mousterian tool tradition associated with Neanderthals across much of Europe and Western Asia involved the careful preparation of stone cores to produce flakes of predictable shape, a technique called l'évaluat that requires planning ahead, visualizing the finished product before the work begins. Different Neanderthal populations developed distinct local variants of this technology. In some regions, tools were more refined, in others, adapted to locally available materials. This wasn't a single, frozen, unchanging culture stamped identically across a continent. It was a family of related traditions with local characters, exactly what you'd expect from populations that were connected but not identical, learning from each other but also innovating within their own territories. This brings us directly to the misconceptions that have shadowed Neanderthals since their remains were first discovered in the 19th century. The initial reconstructions, literally, the physical reconstructions drawn and modelled for public consumption, portrayed them as hunched, slope-browed, barely upright, essentially halfway between ape and human. That image proved extraordinarily persistent, and it was wrong in almost every meaningful detail. Neanderthals walked fully upright. They had brains as large as ours, in some cases larger by volume though structured somewhat differently. They used fire consistently and competently, constructing hearths and using them to cook food, to provide warmth, and possibly to heat-treat stone before working it. They made and maintained composite tools, hafting stone points onto wooden shafts using adhesives they apparently produced themselves through multi-step processes. Each of these behaviors requires forward planning and the ability to hold a sequence of actions in mind toward a future goal. The image of the dim-witted Neanderthal dying off because it simply wasn't smart enough to compete was never well supported by the evidence, and the evidence accumulated in recent decades has made it untenable. We now know from ancient DNA analysis that Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens on multiple occasions. Most people alive today, outside of sub-Saharan Africa, carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, a biological fact that makes the very category of us versus them somewhat complicated. They weren't a failed evolutionary dead end, they were highly successful human relatives who eventually disappeared. But that disappearance came after hundreds of thousands of years of success, and the reasons for it are far more subtle and uncertain than the old narrative suggested. What made them so effective in Ice Age Europe, in the end, comes down to a combination of factors that are easy to underestimate. The physical adaptations were real and meaningful. The social bonds that allowed care of the injured, cooperative hunting and transmission of knowledge across generations gave them resilience that no individual body could achieve alone. Their technology, while different from what came later, was genuinely sophisticated and continuously adapted to local conditions. And they occupied their world not as bewildered survivors barely hanging on, but as the dominant large-bodied predators across an enormous geographic range for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. They built no cities, they left no writing. Their art, if it was art, is subtle and sparse compared to what would follow. But the Neanderthals left something in us, literally in our genomes, and they left an archaeological record that keeps surprising researchers who approach it without the prejudices of earlier generations. Every decade of work chips away a little more at the old dismissive story and replaces it with something more interesting, a human relative of genuine complexity shaped by one of the harshest environments on Earth into something uniquely, stubbornly, impressively alive. Their world was about to change in ways they could not have anticipated. Something was moving westward, a new kind of human, carrying new technologies and new ways of thinking, and the encounter between these two peoples would be one of the most consequential meetings in all of human prehistory. Around 45,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans, people essentially identical to us in biology, began moving into Europe in significant numbers. They came from the east, following corridors through the Near East and the Balkans, pushing gradually into a continent that was already occupied. This wasn't an invasion in any organized military sense. It was more likely a slow, uneven expansion. Small bands, probing new territories, following game, moving along river valleys and coastlines, edging into landscapes that Neanderthals had known for hundreds of thousands of years. The meeting that followed, whenever and however it happened, stands as one of the most extraordinary encounters in the entire human story. The timeline of that expansion is something researchers have been refining for decades, and the picture that's emerged is considerably more complex than a simple wave of migration sweeping west. Genetic and archaeological evidence now suggests that modern humans may have made earlier, tentative forays into Europe before the main expansion, perhaps as far back as 54,000 years ago at some sites, though these earlier pulses may not have left lasting populations. The sustained continent-wide presence that eventually replaced Neanderthals seems to have consolidated between roughly 45,000 and 40,000 years ago, though the exact dates vary by region and are still being actively debated as new sites are excavated and existing ones are redated with improving precision. What did the encounter between these two human populations actually look like? This is where the evidence gets genuinely fascinating and genuinely complicated. For a period that may have lasted anywhere from a few thousand to perhaps 10,000 years, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted across parts of Europe. The extent to which they interacted directly is harder to establish. At some sites, the archaeological layers associated with late Neanderthal technology and those associated with early modern humans are separated by geological boundaries, suggesting they occupied the same places at different times. possibly with significant gaps between them. At other sites, the layers are closer together, raising the possibility of near-contemporaneous occupation of the same region, though not necessarily the same moment. And then there's the genetics. The ancient DNA revolution has fundamentally rewritten this chapter of the story. We now know with considerable confidence that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, not once, but on multiple occasions, in different places and possibly different periods. The signal is preserved in us. People with ancestry outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry Neanderthal DNA, typically somewhere between 1 and 4% of their genome inherited from those ancient encounters. Crucially, the Neanderthal DNA that survived in modern human populations isn't random. Certain stretches appear to have been retained because they were genuinely useful, variants associated with immune function, skin physiology adapted to northern latitudes, and possibly responses to local pathogens that Neanderthals had been exposed to for millennia. Evolution, in other words, kept what worked. The meeting of these two populations was not just a demographic event. It was, in a real biological sense, a merger, partial, asymmetric, but a merger nonetheless. The clean boundary between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens that earlier generations assumed turns out to be considerably blurrier than the textbooks once suggested. Beyond the genetics, the archaeology of this period reveals something else striking about the incoming modern humans, the sheer range and novelty of what they brought with them. The Upper Paleolithic technologies associated with early Homo sapiens in Europe, the Aurignacian, which appears earliest and most widely, show a suite of behaviours that look qualitatively different from what came before, though researchers debate how sharp that break really was. Blade technology, producing long, thin, standardized stone flakes from carefully prepared cores, allowed tools to be made more efficiently and in greater variety. Bone, ivory, and antler were worked into needles, points, and other implements in ways that had no precedent in Neanderthal assemblages at comparable scales. Personal ornaments, perforated shells, carved beads, pendants, appear in remarkable numbers and variety. These objects carry meaning. They signal identity, group membership, status. They're the material signatures of social networks operating over large distances. And those social networks matter enormously. One of the characteristics that increasingly seems to distinguish early modern humans in Europe from their Neanderthal contemporaries is the geographic scale over which they moved and maintained connections. Raw materials, particular types of flint, shells, amber, appear at sites far from their sources, suggesting either direct long-distance travel or trade chains passing objects between groups. Information techniques and probably people moved across these networks too. This kind of connectivity, the ability to maintain relationships and exchange resources over hundreds of kilometers, provides a form of resilience that small, more isolated groups simply cannot match. When local conditions deteriorate, connected populations can draw on resources and knowledge from elsewhere. Isolated ones cannot. This brings us to the question that has occupied researchers for generations. Why did the Neanderthals disappear? The honest answer is that we don't fully know, and anyone who claims otherwise is being overconfident. But we can map the leading explanations and weigh the evidence. Direct, violent conflict between modern humans and Neanderthals has been proposed, and while violence between groups is certainly a feature of human behavior, there's little direct archaeological evidence of systematic interspecies warfare, and the timescales involved make a rapid military conquest implausible. Disease transmission, modern humans introducing pathogens to which Neanderthals had no immunity, is plausible and difficult to rule out, though equally hard to confirm from the fossil record. Climate fluctuation played a role almost certainly. The period of Neanderthal decline coincided with significant environmental instability, which would have stressed populations already potentially under pressure from competition with a new arrival. That competition, though, may have been less about direct confrontation and more about resource overlap and demographic attrition. If modern human groups were even slightly more efficient at exploiting the same landscapes, hunting the same prey, occupying the same shelter sites, drawing on wider social networks to buffer lean years, the mathematics of population ecology suggests that Neanderthal groups could have declined gradually, losing ground over centuries and millennia rather than years. Local populations absorbed into modern human groups through interbreeding, others simply failing to replace themselves in marginal territories. The disappearance need not have been violent, or even particularly dramatic on any human time scale, to be total over a few thousand years. By around 40,000 years ago, possibly somewhat later in a few refuge areas like Gibraltar, Neanderthals as a distinct population were gone. What remained was a continent occupied exclusively by Homo sapiens, but a Homo sapiens population that was not entirely without Neanderthal ancestry. The line between replacement and assimilation is not as clean as the word extinction implies. This transition is one of the pivotal turning points in all of European prehistory, arguably the single most consequential demographic and cultural shift the continent experienced before the arrival of farming. It reset the stage entirely. The tens of thousands of years that followed would be shaped by the descendants of those early modern human pioneers, carrying their networks, their technologies, their symbolic traditions, and their traces of Neanderthal inheritance into a continent that was about to produce something extraordinary, an explosion of human creativity, preserved in stone and bone and pigment that still has the power to stop people in their tracks. What followed that demographic transformation was not a period of stagnation or slow cultural accumulation. It was something far more striking, a flourishing of human creativity and symbolic expression that unfolded across tens of thousands of years, leaving behind evidence that continues to astonish researchers and ordinary visitors alike. The people who now occupied Europe were hunters and gatherers in the most complete sense of the term, and their lives were shaped at every turn by the rhythms of a world in the grip of an ice age. The Upper Paleolithic lifeway was built around mobility. These were not people with permanent homes or fixed addresses. They moved with the seasons, following the migrations of reindeer, bison, horses, and mammoth across landscapes that looked nothing like modern Europe. Much of the continent was open steppe or tundra, treeless and wind-scoured, with glaciers pressing down from Scandinavia and the Alps. The Thames and the Rhine were not sea-separated rivers but tributaries of a vast river system crossing what is now the floor of the North Sea, since sea levels were dramatically lower than today. Bands of perhaps 20 to 50 people tracked herds, cached resources, gathered plant foods when available, and exploited rivers and coastlines. Their movements were likely predictable in broad outline, returning to the same valleys, the same river crossings, the same cliff shelters as the seasons turned, giving structure to lives that were genuinely mobile without being random. Their technology was sophisticated by any meaningful measure. Flint blades and composite tools, hafted points and scrapers combining stone with bone or antler handles, gave them efficient means of processing both prey and plant material. Needles of bone, some of extraordinary fineness, allowed the tailoring of fitted garments from animal hides, a critical adaptation in a world where winter temperatures could be brutal. And across this same period, spread across thousands of years and hundreds of sites, they produced art on a scale that had no precedent in human history. The cave art of Ice Age Europe is among the most discussed and debated bodies of evidence in all of prehistory. Lascaux in the Dordogne, discovered in 1940 and dated to roughly 17,000 years ago, presents viewers with horses, aurochs, deer, and abstract signs painted with a confidence and energy that feels immediate even across the millennia. Chauvet in the Ardèche, dated to around 36,000 years ago, making it among the oldest confirmed figurative art in the world, contains images of lions, rhinos, bears, and mammoths rendered with a sophistication that forced a complete rethinking of how early the capacity for this kind of expression existed. Altamira in northern Spain, its ceiling covered with bison painted and engraved in polychrome, caused such controversy when first published in the 1880s that many scholars refused to believe prehistoric people could have produced it. They were wrong, and the image of that painted ceiling remains one of the defining icons of human prehistory. These are the famous sites, but they are not isolated phenomena. Hundreds of caves across France, Spain, and into Central and Eastern Europe contain painted or engraved imagery, hands stenciled in red and black, geometric signs, therianthropic figures, blending human and animal features, scenes that may depict narrative or may resist that interpretation entirely. The sheer geographic spread and chronological depth of this tradition, it spans from roughly 40,000 years ago almost to the end of the last ice age, tells us that this was not an aberration or a local curiosity. It was a sustained, widespread, deeply rooted aspect of Upper Paleolithic culture. Alongside the cave art existed a parallel tradition of portable art that deserves equal attention. Carved figurines of animals and humans, including the famous Venus figurines, statuettes with exaggerated female forms found from France to Siberia, appear throughout the Upper Paleolithic. The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel, a carved ivory figure combining human body with lion head, dated to around 40,000 years ago, is among the oldest known figurative sculptures anywhere in the world. Perforated shells, carved pendants, beads of mammoth ivory, and ochre-stained objects carried and traded across hundreds of kilometers indicate that symbolic thinking was not confined to cave walls, but was woven into daily life, personal identity, and social exchange. What did all of this mean? This is the question that draws researchers in and rarely lets them out with clean answers. Proposals have ranged widely. Hunting magic, creating images of prey animals to ensure success in the hunt, was among the earliest popular explanations, but the evidence is complicated by the fact that the most commonly depicted animals don't always match the most commonly hunted ones in the faunal remains from the same sites. Shamanic interpretations have gained traction, proposing that the caves represented liminal spaces where altered states of consciousness and communication with animal spirits took place, and that the imagery recorded or enabled those encounters. Some researchers have focused on the social functions of art as markers of group identity, as repositories of collective memory, as tools for transmitting knowledge across generations and across the continent's far-flung social networks. None of these explanations should be dismissed, and none should be accepted as the definitive answer. The people who made this art were cognitively fully modern. They were capable of the same range of motivations, meanings, and interpretations that any humans are. It would be surprising if something as pervasive as image making served only one function or encoded only one kind of meaning. The art almost certainly did different things in different contexts, some of it perhaps deeply ritual, some of it possibly more mundane, some of it marking territory or alliance, some of it expressing something that we might recognize simply as aesthetic impulse. The sophistication of the minds that produced it demands that we resist the temptation to reduce it to a single tidy explanation. What the art does tell us unambiguously is that these were people with rich inner lives, complex social worlds, and a capacity for abstraction, symbolism, and visual communication that was fully realized tens of thousands of years before anyone built a city or wrote a word that matters. It pushes back against any lingering sense that prehistoric people were somehow pre-human in their cognition or experience. They were us, operating in a radically different material world. That material world, though, was changing. Through the final millennia of the Ice Age, roughly from 20,000 years ago onward, the climate began its long, fitful shift toward warmer conditions. Glaciers retreated. The great herds of reindeer and mammoth that had sustained Upper Paleolithic populations began to thin and move northward. Sea levels rose as ice melted, reshaping coastlines and swallowing the land bridges and river plains that had connected communities across what is now open water. Some populations followed their prey northward, others adapted to changing conditions in place. The social networks and cultural traditions built over tens of thousands of years began to fracture and reorganize under environmental pressures that were, by any geological measure, rapid, though they still unfolded over centuries and millennia from any individual human perspective. The world of the cave painters was ending. Something new was coming, and it would require entirely different strategies, different technologies, and different ways of relating to the land. But the extraordinary experiment of Ice Age humanity in Europe, the art, the networks, the adaptations, was not simply erased. It was a foundation imperfectly preserved in pigment and stone for everything that followed. The glaciers didn't retreat overnight. The transition out of the last Ice Age was a long, uneven process, punctuated by cold reversals and sudden warming spikes that unfolded across several thousand years, beginning around 15,000 years ago and reaching something like its modern configuration by roughly 8,000 years ago. But its cumulative effects on European landscapes were nothing short of revolutionary. The open steppe and tundra that had sustained the great herds gave way to dense deciduous and boreal forests spreading northward from southern refugia. Rivers swelled and changed course. The coastlines of Europe were redrawn dramatically as melting ice sheets poured water back into the oceans. Sea levels rose by well over 100 meters across this period, swallowing vast territories that had once been inhabited land. Doggerland, the low-lying plain connecting Britain to continental Europe across what is now the southern North Sea, was gradually inundated, first becoming a marshy archipelago and then disappearing beneath the waves entirely by around 6,500 years ago. People had lived there. We know this because trawlers occasionally dredge up Mesolithic tools and even human bones from the seafloor. An entire inhabited world is now underwater. For the human populations navigating this transformation, the changes demanded profound adaptation. The mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and cave lion were gone, their populations collapsing under the combined pressures of climate change and, quite possibly, sustained human hunting. The reindeer herds that had anchored Upper Paleolithic economies in much of Western Europe moved northward, and some communities followed them. But for many of the people who stayed, the challenge was learning to live in a world that had become structurally different from anything their ancestors had known. Dense forest is not a hostile environment for humans. It is in many ways a generous one, but it requires a completely different set of strategies than open steppe hunting. You can't run down a red deer across open ground the way you might intercept a reindeer herd at a river crossing. You have to become a different kind of hunter. The toolkit of the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age of Europe, spanning very roughly from 10,000 to somewhere between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, depending on region, reflects exactly this kind of intelligent environmental problem-solving. The signature technology of the period is the microlith, tiny, precisely shaped flint blades, often just a centimetre or two long, designed to be hafted in composite arrangements as arrow tips, spear barbs and cutting edges. Where Upper Paleolithic hunters had relied heavily on larger handheld spears for close-range encounters with megafauna, Mesolithic hunters developed sophisticated bow and arrow technology that allowed them to take fast-moving woodland animals from a distance. The shift in tool size is not a sign of cultural decline. It is a sign of ingenuity applied to new problems. What is also striking about the Mesolithic is the explosion of regional specialization. As Europe's environments diversified, forests in the interior, rich wetlands along river valleys, extensive coastlines and estuaries, the emerging Baltic and Atlantic shores, human communities developed increasingly distinct strategies tailored to their specific settings. The people of what is now coastal Scandinavia, for example, became sophisticated marine hunters and fishers, exploiting seal, porpoise, and deep-sea fish in ways that had no real parallel in earlier European prehistory. Shell middens, enormous mounds of discarded shellfish remains along the Atlantic coasts of Portugal, Britain, Ireland, and Denmark, tell us that coastal communities were processing marine resources in systematic, organized ways, returning repeatedly to the same locations across generations. Some of these midden sites preserve remarkable snapshots of Mesolithic life: animal bones, tools, charred plant remains, and even human burials, all compressed into layered archives of daily existence. Fishing technology in particular reached a level of sophistication that is easy to underestimate. Woven fish traps, fixed weirs designed to intercept salmon runs, dugout canoes capable of open water travel, and carefully crafted bone fish hooks appear in the archaeological record across Europe. At Lepenski Vir on the Danube in modern Serbia, a remarkable series of settlements dating to around 7,000 to 8,500 years ago shows communities of fisher-hunters living in trapezoidal houses arranged in careful patterns with elaborate carved stone sculptures and structured burial practices. These are not the nomadic camps of popular imagination. They are something more complex, communities anchored to the extraordinary productivity of a major river, and organized in ways that suggest emerging social structures and shared symbolic life. This points toward one of the most significant shifts of the Mesolithic, the move toward greater sedentism, or at least semi-sedentary settlement patterns. Not all Mesolithic communities became year-round residents of fixed locations. Many remained highly mobile, moving seasonally between river valleys, forests, and coasts to exploit different resources at different times of year. But the sheer productivity of wetland, estuary, and coastal environments created conditions in which groups could afford to stay in one place for extended periods, perhaps overwintering at a favored site, and establishing the kind of investment in place, middens, structures, cemeteries, that implies a sense of territory and belonging. Cemetery evidence is particularly significant. At sites like Skateholm in Sweden and Olenii Ostrov in Russia, Mesolithic burial grounds containing dozens or even hundreds of individuals suggest communities returning to the same location to inter their dead across multiple generations. The dead were buried with grave goods, tools, ornaments, ochre, and in postures that varied in ways possibly reflecting status, age, or role. These are communities with memory, with attachment to place, and with social complexity we are only beginning to map. One of the most intimate pieces of evidence from this period concerns not human relationships with the landscape, but human relationships with another species. The domestic dog appears in Europe during the Mesolithic, with some of the earliest confirmed examples dating to around 14,000 years ago, though the precise timing and geography of domestication remains an active area of research. Dogs buried alongside humans at Mesolithic sites in Scandinavia, Germany, and elsewhere were not simply tools. Some were interred with the same care afforded to people, suggesting emotional bonds that would feel entirely familiar to anyone today. The partnership between dogs and Mesolithic hunters was almost certainly practical, tracking wounded prey through dense forest, alerting camps to approaching danger, but it was also something more. It represents the beginning of a relationship between humans and domesticated animals that would become central to everything that followed. The Mesolithic has sometimes been portrayed as a kind of cultural pause between the dramatic cave-painting cultures of the Ice Age and the transformative Neolithic revolution to come, a waiting room of prehistory, holding on until farming arrived. This framing does not survive close examination. The Mesolithic world was dynamic, inventive, and varied. Communities across Europe were solving genuinely novel problems with genuine creativity, building richer and more complex social worlds in some regions than the skeletal archaeological record initially suggested, and establishing relationships with specific landscapes, rivers, and coastlines that reflect deep knowledge accumulated over centuries. This was a world of its own, not simply a prologue to the next chapter. And yet the next chapter was approaching. Far to the southeast, in the lands of the ancient Near East, something was already underway that would eventually reach Europe and change it more thoroughly than any climate shift had done before. The question was not whether that change would arrive, but how it would unfold, and what would happen when two very different ways of life came into contact. It had been building for thousands of years before it ever reached European shores. In the fertile crescent of the Near East, the arc of land stretching through modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Levant, human communities had been experimenting with the cultivation of wild plants and the management of wild animals since at least 10,000 BCE, and perhaps considerably earlier. Wheat, barley, lentils, peas, and other crops were gradually brought under human control. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were domesticated, their behavior and biology slowly reshaped by selective pressure applied across generations. What emerged was not a sudden invention, but a long cumulative shift in how people related to the natural world, from harvesting what the landscape offered to actively producing food on their own terms. By around 7000 BCE, agricultural village life was well established across much of the Near East, and from there, farming began its long journey westward into Europe. The routes it took were multiple, and they were not random. Geography channeled the spread of agriculture along certain natural corridors, and the archaeological record lets us trace at least two major pathways with reasonable confidence. The first ran through the Balkans and into Central Europe along the great river valleys, the Danube, the Rhine, the Elbe, that acted as highways into the continental interior. This route brought farming into southeastern Europe by around 6500 BCE, and communities practicing a recognizable agricultural package cultivated cereals, legumes, domesticated animals, pottery, spread northwestward with remarkable speed from there, reaching Central Europe by around 5500 BCE and eventually pushing into the British Isles and Scandinavia in the centuries that followed. The second major route ran along the Mediterranean coastline, spreading from the Aegean into Italy, southern France, Iberia, and North Africa, through a combination of coastal migration and island hopping that the sea made possible for people with boats. These were not entirely separate streams. They interacted, diverged, and influenced each other in complex ways. But identifying them at all helps us understand that agriculture did not wash over Europe in a single undifferentiated wave. What did early Neolithic life actually look like on the ground? The material signature that archaeologists most reliably trace is the linear pottery culture, named for the distinctive incised decorations on its ceramics, which spread rapidly across Central Europe in the 6th and 5th millennia BCE. These communities built long houses, massive timber structures, sometimes 20 or 30 meters in length, constructed from heavy wooden posts set in the earth, and likely housing both people and their livestock under one roof or within adjacent enclosures. Villages consisted of clusters of these longhouses, and while settlements were not permanent in the modern sense, communities might abandon a site after a generation or two as local soils became exhausted, The scale and investment involved in constructing them represents a fundamentally different relationship with place than anything the Mesolithic had produced in most of Europe. Around the villages lay cleared fields where grain was cultivated with simple digging tools, and eventually the ard, a primitive plough. Beyond the fields grazed cattle and sheep, pigs rooted through forest margins. The landscape was being shaped deliberately and systematically for human use in ways it had never been before. The diet of early European farmers was genuinely different from that of their Mesolithic neighbours and predecessors. Isotope analysis of human bones, which preserves a chemical record of what people ate across their lifetimes, shows that incoming farmers relied very heavily on domesticated cereals and terrestrial animal products and relatively little on fish and wild game. This is striking because many of the regions these farmers settled were, from a hunter-gatherer perspective, rich in exactly the wild resources the farmers were ignoring. The Neolithic package did not arrive as a supplement to existing strategies. It arrived as a replacement, one that demanded very different patterns of labour, land management and seasonal organisation. Clearing forest for fields, tending livestock through winter, storing surplus grain. These activities tied people to specific places and created new rhythms of annual work, quite unlike the flexible, mobile rhythms of forager life. And this raises one of the most fascinating and contested questions of European prehistory. What actually happened when farming met the existing world of Mesolithic hunters and gatherers? The old view imagined a relatively simple process. Farmers arrived, hunter-gatherers disappeared or were absorbed, end of story. Modern genetics has made this picture far more complicated and far more interesting. Ancient DNA analysis of Neolithic human remains has confirmed that the spread of farming into Europe was driven, at least in part, by actual population movement, real people migrating from Anatolia and the Aegean into Europe, bringing their agricultural knowledge and their biological ancestry with them. In some regions, this incoming genetic signal is so strong that it implies the near-complete replacement of earlier Mesolithic populations, at least in terms of the genetic contribution they left to later generations. But replacement was not the only story. In certain regions, particularly along the Atlantic coast in Scandinavia, and in some inland areas, the evidence suggests prolonged coexistence, exchange, and eventually intermingling between farming communities and indigenous foragers. At some sites, we find cemeteries containing individuals of mixed ancestry, suggesting intermarriage across what had been a cultural boundary. At others, we find Mesolithic people apparently adopting elements of the Neolithic package, pottery, perhaps some domesticated animals, without fully abandoning their mobile hunting-focused way of life. The frontier between farmers and foragers was not a clean line but a messy, dynamic zone of contact that played out differently in different places and at different times. What motivated the spread? The honest answer is that we cannot fully know. Climate may have played a role, as periods of warming and drying in the Near East put pressure on existing communities to move. Population growth within already established farming societies may have driven constant outward expansion into new territories. And the productivity of farming, despite its very real costs in labour and vulnerability to crop failure, made it capable of supporting far higher population densities than foraging, which means farming communities, once established, could grow in ways that hunter-gatherer populations simply could not match. The consequences for Europe's landscapes were profound and lasting. Forests were cleared, soils were worked, river valleys and lowland plains that had been hunting grounds became agricultural land. The biological diversity of managed fields and pastures began to differ from the diversity of old-growth forest. Pollen preserved in lake sediments records the dramatic signature of early farming. Sudden declines in tree pollen, simultaneous rises in the pollen of cereals and weeds that flourish in disturbed ground. These are the fingerprints of a landscape being actively reorganized. And with larger, denser populations came new social pressures over land, over resources, over status, that would begin to reshape how European communities organized themselves, governed themselves, and thought about the world around them. The revolution had arrived, and there was no going back. By the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, European farming communities had moved well past the initial experimental phase of agriculture. The rough frontier between farmers and foragers had largely resolved itself across much of the continent, and in its place emerged something that looks, at least in outline, like settled agrarian life on a genuinely substantial scale. Villages grew more permanent. Fields were tended across generations, not abandoned after a decade. Livestock herds were managed with increasing sophistication. The landscape itself began to carry the accumulated marks of long-term human intention: cleared hilltops, maintained trackways, boundaries between worked land and wild space that communities recognized and defended. These were not cities, they were not kingdoms, but they were societies with deep roots in specific places and with something that increasingly looked like shared identity. And then they started building monuments that would outlast almost everything else they ever made. The megalithic tradition, the construction of massive stone structures across much of Atlantic and northwestern Europe, is one of the most visually dramatic and intellectually challenging phenomena in all of prehistoric archaeology. The word megalith simply means large stone, but the structures these stones were assembled into ranged from single standing stones scattered across hilltops to elaborately engineered complexes that required extraordinary feats of collective organization. What we sometimes forget is how early much of this begins. The Great Passage tomb at Newgrange in Ireland was completed around 3200 BCE, making it older than the pyramids at Giza by several centuries. The megalithic tombs of Brittany, the alignments at Karnak, the chambered cairns, the dolmens scattered across the Breton landscape, represent centuries of continuous monument building that began by around 4500 BCE in some cases. Stonehenge, in its first significant phase, a circular earthwork with timber posts, dates to around 3000 BCE, with the famous stone settings coming somewhat later. These were not isolated curiosities. They were part of a broad, shared tradition of monumentality that stretched from Malta to Scandinavia, from Iberia to the British Isles, produced by communities with no writing, no centralized state, and no professional priesthood that we can identify with certainty. The monuments served multiple purposes, and burial was among the most important. Megalithic tombs, passage graves, gallery graves, chambered cairns were not simply places to deposit the dead. The evidence from their interiors tells a more complicated and more fascinating story. At Newgrange, the chamber is precisely oriented so that the rising sun on the winter solstice sends a beam of light down the passage and illuminates the inner chamber for a matter of minutes. This is not accidental. It represents an intimate engineered relationship between the architecture of the dead and the movements of the sky that required both sophisticated astronomical observation and the sustained labor of a community committed to getting it exactly right. Inside many passage graves, the remains of the dead were not interred and left undisturbed. Bones were moved, sorted, and sometimes rearranged over long periods, suggesting repeated access and ritual engagement with ancestral remains that may have continued for generations after the original construction. Burial customs more broadly tell us a great deal about what these communities valued and how they understood themselves. In collective tombs, the remains of many individuals were mingled together, dozens or even hundreds of people over time, in a way that emphasized communal identity and shared ancestry rather than the distinction of any single individual. Grave goods found with the dead include pottery, stone tools, jewelry made from bone and shell, and occasionally objects that suggest long-distance exchange networks reaching far beyond any single community's territory. Certain individuals do appear to have been accorded special treatment, positioned differently, given richer assemblages, which hints at the existence of status, but whether this reflected inherited rank or achieved prestige or something else entirely remains genuinely debated. The picture is of societies that were neither strictly egalitarian nor rigidly hierarchical, but somewhere in a complex space between those poles. Beyond the tombs, Neolithic communities built ritual enclosures, causewayed camps, henges, timber circles, that appear to have functioned as gathering places rather than domestic sites. The causewayed enclosures of Britain and northern France, ringed by multiple ditches interrupted by causeways of undug earth, show evidence of episodic large-scale activity, feasting, the deposition of human and animal remains, the exchange of objects from distant regions. These were places where people came together, probably at regular seasonal intervals, in numbers that no single farming village could have produced on its own. They were, in a meaningful sense, social infrastructure, places that created and reinforced connections between communities spread across wide territories. The exchange networks visible in the archaeological record are striking. Specific types of stone for axes and tools were quarried at particular locations: the mountains of Wales, the Alps, the volcanic rocks of northern Italy, and then distributed across hundreds of kilometers in ways that suggest these objects carried social meaning well beyond their practical utility. A polished stone axe made from rock, quarried at a specific sacred or prestige location, may have functioned as much as a symbol of connection and status as a tool for felling trees. These networks tied communities together across distance and ensured that ideas, objects, and presumably people moved through the landscape in ways that created a genuinely interconnected, if loosely organized, cultural world. The question that all of this raises most insistently is one of the most interesting in all of European prehistory. How did people do this without states, without writing, without professional religious institutions? The effort required to build Newgrange or the Karnak alignments was immense: quarrying stone, transporting it, engineering complex structures with precise astronomical orientations, maintaining the effort across what must have been multiple generations of workers. How do you coordinate that without bureaucracy? One answer may be that ritual itself performed organizational functions that we now associate with formal governance. Shared belief, shared ceremony, and the authority of ancestral connection may have been powerful enough motivators to mobilize labor on scales that look almost institutional. Leaders, perhaps religious specialists, perhaps individuals with hereditary authority, perhaps both, could have directed collective effort through cultural legitimacy rather than political coercion. Another part of the answer is time. These monuments were not necessarily built in single concentrated campaigns. Many grew gradually, accumulated incrementally, modified and expanded over centuries by communities for whom maintaining and adding to an ancestral monument may have been an ongoing obligation rather than a one-time project. The act of building was itself part of the ritual, a way of connecting the living to the dead, of asserting a claim to land through demonstrated ancestral presence, of creating visible marks in the landscape that said, "We have always been here, and this place is ours." That claim mattered enormously in a world where different communities competed for agricultural land, pasture, and the prestige that came from controlling important places and routes. The monuments were statements as much as structures, arguments made in stone, that the people who built them intended to endure far longer than any individual life, or even any single generation. And they did endure. The Neolithic communities that raised them are long gone, but their monuments still stand, still catch the winter solstice sun, still draw people to them across 5,000 years of unbroken human curiosity. Something was changing in Europe around the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, something that went deeper than the gradual accumulation of agricultural experience or the slow elaboration of ritual traditions. Across much of the continent, a cluster of new developments began reshaping how communities lived, what they valued, and how far their connections reached. The monuments of the Neolithic world didn't vanish overnight, but the world that had produced them was beginning to shift in ways that would, over several centuries, transform Europe almost beyond recognition. The discovery of metallurgy was among the most consequential of those changes. Copper had been worked in small quantities in southeastern Europe from as early as the 5th millennium BCE, hammered cold into beads and ornaments at sites in the Balkans and the Carpathian Basin in ways that exploited the metal's natural malleability without yet involving smelting. But true metallurgy, the extraction of copper from ore through heat, opened possibilities on a different scale entirely. Copper tools and weapons were not immediately superior to stone in every respect. A well-knapped flint blade can hold an edge remarkably well, but copper offered something stone could not: the ability to reshape, recast, and repair. It was also crucially rare and difficult to produce, which meant that objects made from it carried enormous social weight. The earliest copper axes and daggers were prestige objects before they were practical ones. Owning them, displaying them, giving them as gifts, these acts communicated status and established connections between individuals in ways that polished stone axes had done before, but with an added dimension of scarcity and technical mystique. The people who understood how to work metal occupied a remarkable position in their communities. The exchange networks that had already been threading through Neolithic Europe expanded and intensified around these new materials. Copper sources in the Alps, the Carpathians, and the Iberian Peninsula became nodes in trade routes that moved objects and ideas across enormous distances. Alongside copper moved amber from the Baltic coast, shells from the Mediterranean, fine pottery, and other goods whose primary value was social rather than purely functional. What archaeologists call prestige goods economies were developing, in which access to rare and beautiful objects signaled connection to distant places and distant people, and in which elites or aspiring elites competed to accumulate and redistribute wealth. Burial practices began to reflect this new social terrain. Where many Neolithic tombs had mingled the remains of communities together in shared ancestral statements, late Neolithic and Chalcolithic graves increasingly placed individuals at their center, accompanied by copper weapons, fine beakers, gold ornaments, and other markers of personal distinction. The shift from collective to individual burial is not a clean or universal pattern. Regional variation was considerable, but the trend is striking enough across enough of Europe to suggest a broad change in how status and identity were being understood and expressed. Then there were the technologies reshaping daily life in ways that were perhaps less glamorous than metallurgy, but equally transformative. The wheel appears in Europe in the late 4th millennium BCE, almost certainly as part of a broader package of innovations that may have connections to developments in the Near East and the steppes. Wheeled vehicles, heavy solid-wheeled wagons initially, changed what was possible in terms of moving goods across landscapes, pulling loads that draft animals alone could not efficiently manage. Closely related was the secondary products revolution, a term archaeologists use to describe the shift toward exploiting domestic animals not just for their meat, but for the sustained products their living bodies could provide: milk and dairy products, wool, and above all traction. Animals pulling ploughs, ards in their earliest form, could turn soil in ways that opened new land to cultivation and increased agricultural productivity on a significant scale. These changes together meant that land could be worked more extensively, surpluses could accumulate more reliably, and the logic of pastoral mobility became more viable alongside settled farming. Communities that had been rooted to specific village sites for generations might now find advantages in more flexible patterns of movement, following herds, trading along routes, and establishing connections across wider territories. All of these threads converge, in a particularly fascinating way, in a single remarkable individual found preserved in the ice of the Ötztal Alps in 1991. Ötzi, as he has come to be known, died around 3300 BCE, a date that places him squarely in this transitional period. The extraordinary preservation of his body and equipment has made him one of the most studied individuals from all of prehistory. He carried a copper axe, a quiver of arrows with fletched shafts, a bow still being prepared, multiple tools of flint and bone, and clothing assembled from the hides and furs of at least 5 different animal species. Analysis of his teeth and bones suggests he grew up in one valley and spent his adult life partly in another. His last meal included ibex meat, red deer, einkorn wheat, and various plants, a diet that reflected both hunting and farming. And he was killed, an arrowhead lodged in his shoulder, apparently fired from behind, suggests violence rather than accident. Ötzi is a window into a world that was simultaneously ancient and remarkably sophisticated, mobile, connected, armed, and evidently not peaceful. He was a man moving through a landscape that was already crisscrossed with roots, rivalries, and dangers. The bell beaker phenomenon, spreading across much of Western and Central Europe from roughly 2800 to 1800 BCE, captures the complexity of this transitional moment better than almost anything else. Named for a distinctive style of pottery, inverted bell-shaped drinking vessels, often elaborately decorated, the bell beaker package shows up across a territory stretching from Iberia to Britain to Central Europe, associated with a consistent set of goods, copper daggers, stone wrist guards for archery, specific types of arrowheads and personal ornaments. The question of what exactly this package represents has generated debate for well over a century. Was it the spread of a people, a religion, a prestige drinking culture that spread through exchange and emulation, adopted by local elites who wanted to signal their membership in a wider world? Recent ancient DNA analysis has complicated and enriched the debate considerably. The evidence suggests that in Britain and parts of Central Europe, the spread of bell beaker culture was accompanied by substantial population replacement. The genetic profile of Britain, after the beaker arrival, is strikingly different from what came before, suggesting significant migration. But in Iberia, where bell beaker pottery also appears in abundance, the population signal is much weaker, implying that the same cultural package spread primarily through adoption rather than replacement. The bell beaker world was neither simply a people nor simply a fashion. It was probably both in different proportions in different places, which is exactly the kind of messy, regionally variable answer that the prehistoric record tends to reward. What all of this adds up to is a Europe that was, in the centuries around 3000 to 2500 BCE, becoming simultaneously more interconnected and more internally diverse. Shared objects, shared styles, shared innovations moved with remarkable speed across the continent along networks that were real and active. Yet the communities that participated in those networks were developing increasingly distinct regional identities, different burial rites, different ceramic traditions, different relationships to land and mobility. Europe was not converging into a single culture. It was weaving itself into something more like a web, connected at countless points, but different at every node. What came next? Bronze, long-distance trade on a continental scale, the emergence of warrior elites would build directly on the foundations being laid in this restless transitional moment. Around 2200 BCE, Something clicked into place that would redefine European civilization for the better part of 1,000 years. Smiths working somewhere in the arc between the British Isles and the Aegean discovered, or inherited the discovery, that copper mixed with tin produced something qualitatively different from either metal alone. Bronze, that seemingly simple alloy, was harder, tougher, held an edge better, and could be cast into shapes that copper alone struggled to hold cleanly. It wasn't a sudden invention so much as a convergence of knowledge, experimentation, and access, but its consequences were profound and far-reaching in ways that went well beyond the technical. To understand why bronze mattered so much, consider what it made possible. A bronze sword could be cast long and thin, with a shape optimized for fighting rather than simply cutting or hacking. Bronze axes held their edge through repeated use in ways that forced constant resharpening with copper tools. Socketed spearheads, elaborate helmets, fitted armor, forms that were mechanically impractical in copper became achievable in bronze. Warriors could now equip themselves in ways that were genuinely more effective, not just symbolically impressive. And the symbolic dimension was itself transformative. Bronze was difficult to produce, requiring two separate raw materials, copper and tin, that were rarely found together in the same place. The logistics of obtaining both, combining them correctly, and casting the results required specialized knowledge and significant social investment. That difficulty made bronze objects enormously valuable, which meant that who owned them, who gave them, and who was buried with them said something powerful about position, power, and identity. The social world that grew up around bronze production and exchange was in many respects a new kind of Europe. What archaeologists identify as early Bronze Age elites were not simply wealthy individuals. They were figures whose authority was displayed through a very particular vocabulary of objects and practices. The warrior identity became central in a way it hadn't quite been before. Graves from across Central and Northern Europe in the early 2nd millennium BCE show men interred with bronze daggers, spearheads and axes, sometimes alongside whetstone for sharpening them, suggesting that the martial role was something curated and performed as much as lived. In some regions, individuals were buried with objects that had clearly come from far away. Amber beads from the Baltic, faience ornaments with possible connections to the Eastern Mediterranean, gold worked in styles that echoed traditions hundreds of kilometers distant. These were not just beautiful things, they were statements. This person was connected. This person mattered in a world that stretched beyond the horizon. Burial mounds, barrows, became one of the most visible expressions of this new social order. Raised over individual graves, sometimes on hilltops or ridge lines, where they could be seen from considerable distances, barrows were architectural declarations of status and ancestry. The person beneath was being lifted above the landscape, marked out as someone worth remembering, someone whose lineage deserved a monument. Inside, the richest graves contained bronze weapons and tools, gold ornaments, amber and jet beads, ceramic vessels, and sometimes the remains of vehicles or animal sacrifices. The famous Unanswered culture, centered in what is now central Germany and the Czech Republic, produced some of the most spectacular early Bronze Age metalwork in Europe. Hordes of bronze axes, ingots, and ornaments buried with a precision that suggests both wealth and ritual meaning. The Nebraskae disc, found in a hoard dated to around 1600 BCE and associated with this broader cultural horizon, offers a tantalizing glimpse of early Bronze Age cosmology. A bronze disc inlaid with gold representations of the sun, moon, and what are probably the Pleiades, its precise astronomical significance still debated, but its extraordinary craftsmanship unmistakable. What underpinned all of this was trade, and trade on a continental scale that can genuinely astonish. Tin, essential to making bronze, occurs in relatively few places across Europe. Cornwall in southwestern Britain, Brittany in northwestern France, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula were among the significant sources, as were deposits in what is now Saxony and Bohemia. The copper needed to make the alloy came from the Alps, from Ireland, from the Iberian Peninsula, from Cyprus and the eastern Mediterranean. These materials had to move enormous distances before they could be combined, which means that Bronze Age Europe was, almost from the beginning of the period, dependent on long-distance exchange networks operating across the continent and beyond. Follow the amber and the picture becomes even more striking. Baltic amber, the fossilized resin prized across the ancient world for its warm golden color and its static generating properties, which may have given it a connection to ideas about lightning and the divine, shows up in graves across Central Europe, in the Mediterranean, and even in the Near East. Analysis of amber found in Mycenaean shaft graves in Greece in the mid-2nd millennium BCE suggests a Baltic origin, meaning that material was moving from the shores of what is now Denmark and the Polish coast all the way to the Aegean. These trade routes were not passive channels through which goods happened to drift. They were actively maintained by communities and individuals with strong interests in keeping them open. The growth of chiefdoms, societies organized around powerful individual leaders who controlled access to prestige goods, managed redistribution, and negotiated alliances, was both a cause and a consequence of these networks. A chief's authority rested partly on the ability to obtain bronze weapons to arm followers, to give gifts that bound subordinates, to bury family members with the right objects in the right way. Chiefs needed the networks to function, and the networks needed chiefs to organize the accumulation and movement of goods. The result was a feedback loop. More trade produced more differentiated elites, who in turn drove more trade. What makes the early Bronze Age particularly fascinating from a historical perspective is the way metallurgy functioned as a kind of connective tissue for the continent. A smith working in southern Britain and a smith working in Hungary were operating within different local traditions, different cultural contexts, different social structures, yet they were also linked by the shared requirements of their craft. Both needed tin and copper. Both responded to designs and styles circulating through exchange networks. Both produced objects that could and did travel. The distinctive shapes of bronze axes or swords that appear with variations across huge swaths of Europe suggest that ideas as well as materials were moving. Craftsmen seeing objects from elsewhere and adapting them, patrons demanding styles they had encountered through trade, fashions spreading through networks of gift-giving and emulation. Europe in the early Bronze Age was not unified, and it would be wrong to suggest otherwise. Regional cultures remained deeply distinct in their pottery, their burial rites, their settlement patterns. But the Bronze Age introduced something genuinely new, a set of dependencies and connections that meant developments in one corner of the continent could ripple across to another. The warrior with Baltic amber beads and an Atlantic tin bronze sword was wearing the product of a continent. That level of integration, fragile and uneven as it was, would only deepen as the Bronze Age reached its remarkable peak. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, the networks and social structures that had been taking shape in the early Bronze Age matured into something considerably more complex and, in certain respects, more impressive. This was Bronze Age Europe operating at full intensity, a world of expanding connections, specialized production, elaborate ritual, and competitive display that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the steppes and from Scandinavia down to the shores of the Mediterranean. What archaeology reveals from this period is not a uniform civilization, but something arguably more interesting, a mosaic of distinct regional cultures operating within a shared framework of exchange, influence, and interregional contact that gave the whole era a recognizable character. The trade networks of this period were extraordinary in their reach and variety. You had Atlantic routes running along the western seaboard of Europe, connecting communities in Ireland and Britain with those in northwestern France, the Iberian Peninsula, and ultimately with cultures pressing inward through the river systems of Central Europe. You had river corridors, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Danube, the Elbe, functioning as arteries along which metal, amber, gold and finished objects moved in both directions. You had Mediterranean connections linking the Aegean world to Italy, to southern Iberia, to the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, which in the Middle Bronze Age emerged as significant players in their own right. The Nuragic civilization of Sardinia, for instance, built extraordinary stone towers across the island and maintained maritime connections stretching in multiple directions, a reminder that this was not simply a story of continental European cultures looking inward, but of seafaring communities actively bridging distant worlds. Seafaring itself was more sophisticated than many people assume. The Bronze Age boats found preserved in the River Humber in England, and those depicted in Scandinavian rock art, suggest vessels capable of open water crossings, built for cargo and crewed by people who understood how to navigate coastlines and read weather. The Irish Sea and the English Channel were not barriers but highways, and communities on either shore were in regular enough contact to develop shared artistic traditions and participate in common exchange systems. Movement of goods and people across what is now Denmark and southern Scandinavia connected the Baltic amber routes to the broader European system, and the volume of amber reaching the Mediterranean in this period suggests that these connections were functioning with something approaching commercial regularity, even if framed in the language of gift exchange and alliance, rather than trade in any modern sense. Settlements and fortified sites tell a parallel story about how societies were organizing themselves. Across much of Bronze Age Europe, communities clustered into settlements that show increasing evidence of planning, specialization and defense. The lake-dwelling settlements of the Alpine foothills, built on platforms over the water, preserved in remarkable detail by the waterlogged conditions, give us unusually intimate windows into daily life. Stored grain, textile implements, wooden tools, the bones of consumed animals, the remains of craft production. But it is the fortified hilltop sites, growing in number and size through the Middle and later Bronze Age, that speak most directly to the competitive, sometimes violent character of the age. Sites like Spišský Troktrok in Slovakia or the many defended enclosures in Atlantic Europe were not simply places of refuge. They were centers of production and redistribution, where metalworking took place, where goods were accumulated, where power was concentrated and expressed architecturally. That architecture of power was matched by an equally elaborate, symbolic vocabulary. Bronze Age elites across much of Europe were deeply invested in feasting as a political practice. The large bronze cauldrons, drinking vessels and sets of metalwork found in high-status contexts across Central and Northern Europe, and the quantities of animal bone from some sites suggesting large-scale communal eating point to feasts as occasions for cementing alliances, demonstrating generosity, and performing status in front of audiences that mattered. The famous Danish oak coffin burials, dating to around 1400 BCE and preserved with astonishing completeness in burial mounds, show men and women dressed in woolen garments and interred with objects that speak directly to this world: razors, tweezers, folding stools, elaborate bronze belt ornaments. These were people for whom appearance, ceremony, and the performance of identity were clearly central concerns. One of the most striking and somewhat puzzling aspects of Bronze Age Europe is the practice of ritual deposition, the deliberate placing of valuable objects in bogs, lakes, rivers, and wetlands, with no apparent intention of recovery. Across the entire period, and the entire continent, Communities were withdrawing bronze weapons, tools, ornaments, and sometimes astonishing quantities of metal from circulation and committing them to water. The nature of these deposits varies enormously. Sometimes a single sword, sometimes hordes of dozens of axes, sometimes elaborately constructed assemblages that seem arranged with deliberate care. What unites them is the watery context and the sense that these objects were not lost but given, offered to whatever powers or presences were understood to inhabit those liminal places where land dissolved into water. It represents an enormous investment of material wealth, which raises genuine questions about how we interpret Bronze Age economy and ideology. These were not societies simply maximizing the utility of metal. They were societies for whom the controlled destruction of value served purposes that clearly outweighed the practical cost. Artistically, the Middle and later Bronze Age produced some of the most visually remarkable objects in all of European prehistory. The Trundholm sun chariot from Denmark, a bronze horse drawing a gold-plated solar disk on wheels, dated to around 1400 BCE, encapsulates the cosmological sophistication of the period in a single object. Rock art in Scandinavia, particularly in the Bohuslän region of Sweden, depicts ships, warriors, ritual scenes and animals with an energy and detail that opens tantalizing questions about the mythological world that produced them. Shields, helmets and body armor of bronze appear in this period not merely as practical equipment, but as theatrical objects, their scale and finish suggesting display and ceremony as much as battlefield function. What does archaeology suggest about power and conflict in this world? The evidence is genuinely mixed. There are clear signs of organized violence, battlefield sites, weapon trauma on skeletal remains, fortifications that imply something worth defending against real threats. But there is also abundant evidence for sustained, mutually beneficial exchange and cultural borrowing between communities that could have been rivals. The interregional contact visible in the archaeological record, shared artistic motifs, recycled metal moving across enormous distances, prestige objects buried far from their points of origin, suggests that the Bronze Age elites of Europe had strong incentives to maintain relationships as well as to compete. Power in this world was likely built as much through connection as through conquest, as much through giving as through taking. What emerges from the full picture is a Bronze Age Europe of remarkable dynamism, a continent wired together by shared dependencies and shared ambitions, diverse in its local expressions, yet unmistakably participating in something larger than any single community or region could sustain alone. But that very complexity carried within it the seeds of fragility. The same extended networks that made the height of the Bronze Age possible would eventually prove vulnerable in ways that nobody living through its peak could easily have predicted. Around 1200 BCE, and in the centuries that followed, something shifted across much of the ancient world. The palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean contracted or collapsed. Major centers in Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant were abandoned, destroyed, or dramatically reduced. The Mycenaean world, that had been a significant pole of Mediterranean exchange, ceased to function as it had. And in Europe, though the story is more uneven and considerably less dramatic than the simultaneous upheavals to the southeast, the Late Bronze Age brought its own cycle of disruption, reorganization, and change that would ultimately transform the continent's trajectory. The signs of stress in European archaeology from roughly 1200 to 800 BCE are real, but they resist easy summary. In some regions, settlements that had been thriving centers of production and exchange show evidence of destruction or abandonment. Hill forts and defended enclosures multiply across wide areas, suggesting that communities felt increasingly threatened and were investing substantially in protection. The quantities of bronze hoarded in the ground increased dramatically, not the ritual depositions in bogs and rivers that characterized the preceding period, but concealment hoards, objects buried in pots or wrapped in cloth and hidden in the earth, in patterns that suggest people expected to come back for them and sometimes did not. Across parts of Central Europe, the Atlantic zone, and the British Isles, the sheer volume of metal removed from circulation and buried during this period is striking. It speaks to instability, to the perceived need to protect accumulated wealth from dangers real or anticipated. What caused this? The honest answer is that there was almost certainly no single cause, and the search for one probably leads us astray. Climate reconstruction increasingly suggests that the Late Bronze Age in Europe was a period of genuine environmental stress, cooler, wetter conditions in some regions, drought in others, agricultural disruption that would have placed pressure on the food surpluses that supported specialist craft workers, long-distance traders, and the elite feasting networks that had bound Bronze Age society together. A system that works smoothly under favorable conditions can begin to fray when harvests fail for several years running and the margins that allowed for generosity and exchange narrow significantly. Trade disruption played its own role. The Mediterranean connections that had funneled prestige goods northward and created demand for European metals were damaged by whatever was happening in the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. When the palace systems of Greece collapsed, the demand signals they sent rippling through exchange networks changed or disappeared. Communities in Central and Western Europe that had oriented production partly toward long-distance exchange suddenly found the system delivering fewer returns. The social structures built on controlling those networks, the warrior elites who had commanded access to bronze, presided over feasts, and expressed their power through elaborate ceremony, faced challenges to the foundations of their authority. Conflict appears to have intensified in this period. The evidence is not simply the growing number of fortified sites, though that is significant. It is also visible in the archaeology of weapons themselves. Bronze swords, spears, and shields proliferate during the Late Bronze Age in ways that suggest genuine military investment rather than purely ceremonial production. Skeletal evidence from some sites shows weapon trauma. The battlefield site at Tolentz in northern Germany, dated to around 1250 BCE, offers perhaps the most direct evidence yet found for organized large-scale violence in prehistoric Europe. Hundreds of individuals killed in what appears to have been a pitched battle, their remains left where they fell and preserved in a river valley. This was not raiding or small-scale conflict. It suggests organized groups, potentially from different regions, engaging in something that looks disturbingly like warfare in a recognizable sense. And yet, and this is crucial, the Late Bronze Age crisis in Europe was not uniform collapse. The picture varies enormously by region, and that variation is itself one of the most important things archaeology reveals about how prehistoric societies respond to stress. In the British Isles, this period sees major disruption to earlier patterns, but also adaptation, new settlement forms, the reorganization of land use, communities restructuring themselves rather than simply dissolving. In Scandinavia, the transition is more gradual. In parts of Central Europe, the Urnfield cultures that gave this Late Bronze Age horizon its archaeological name, characterized by cremation burial and the deposition of ashes in ceramic urns, actually represent a period of considerable cultural vitality even as patterns elsewhere were disrupting. The Urnfield phenomenon spread across enormous areas of Europe during this period, suggesting population movement, cultural diffusion, or both. But it was not simply a culture of crisis. It was also a culture of adaptation, of communities reorganizing their relationships with the dead, with the land, and with each other in ways that proved durable. This regional variation underlines something worth sitting with. Prehistoric crises do not behave like the tidy catastrophes that historical narratives sometimes require. There is rarely a single event, a single cause, a single moment of before and after. What archaeology reveals instead is something more like a prolonged period of instability in which some communities collapsed, others contracted and survived, and others adapted and in some cases emerged stronger. The end of the Bronze Age in Europe was not the end of everything. It was a transformation, painful and uneven, but also generative. One transformation with lasting consequences was the shift in relationship to iron. Iron had been known in Europe for some time before the late Bronze Age crisis deepened, but it was rare, difficult to work, and treated largely as a curiosity or prestige material. What changed was not the knowledge of iron, but the incentive to develop it. As the long-distance exchange networks that supplied tin, essential for bronze production, became unreliable, and the social systems that had managed access to metal came under pressure, communities that could develop local iron production had a significant advantage. Iron ore is far more widely available than either copper or tin. It did not require the same extraordinary network of connections to obtain. A society that mastered iron smithing could equip itself from local resources in a way that bronze-dependent societies simply could not. The late Bronze Age crisis therefore prepared the ground for the Iron Age, not by destroying everything that came before, but by reshaping the incentive structure that had governed technological choice for centuries. The disruption that burned through parts of Europe's Bronze Age world cleared space, socially, economically, ideologically, for new configurations to emerge. The elites who came out the other side of this period would wield iron rather than bronze, would organize their power somewhat differently, and would inherit a landscape that had been transformed by the upheavals their predecessors had lived through. What followed was not a new beginning so much as the next chapter in a very long story of human adaptation, built directly on the foundations and the rubble of what had come before. Iron did not arrive in Europe with a bang. It crept in slowly, tentatively, through the hands of smiths learning to work a material that was in many ways harder to master than bronze. Bronze is forgiving. It flows when melted, cools predictably, and can be cast into complex shapes with relative ease. Iron demands far more from the person working it. It must be heated to extreme temperatures, hammered repeatedly to remove impurities, and worked with a level of skill that took generations to develop into reliable craft knowledge. But once that knowledge was established and spreading, the consequences were profound. Not because iron immediately produced better tools and weapons, though in time it often did, but because the raw material itself was everywhere. You did not need access to a long-distance trade network running from Britain to the Aegean to make an iron axe. You needed a local deposit of ore, charcoal for the furnace, and someone who knew what they were doing. That combination, local availability and increasing technical mastery, is what made iron genuinely transformative over the course of the early first millennium BCE. Agricultural tools became cheaper and more accessible. Communities that could not previously afford to equip their farmers with good metal implements now could. Forests could be cleared more efficiently. Land that had been difficult to cultivate became workable, and the productive base of European societies gradually expanded. This was not a revolution that happened overnight. It was a slow generational accumulation of small advantages that cumulatively shifted what European communities could do and how they organized themselves to do it. By around 800 BCE, iron technology was well established across much of Central Europe, and what archaeologists call the Hallstatt period was taking shape. Named for a site in the Austrian Alps where a remarkable cemetery was excavated in the 19th century. Over 1,000 graves revealing extraordinary richness in burial goods, the Hallstatt world, represents one of the most compelling episodes in European prehistory. The cemetery at Hallstatt itself sits near salt mines that had been worked since the Bronze Age, and it is almost certainly no coincidence that this wealth was built on salt. Preserved meat, preserved fish, preserved hides. Salt was essential to the ancient economy in ways that are easy to underestimate from a modern vantage point. The communities controlling access to it controlled something genuinely valuable, and that control translated into social power with remarkable directness. What the Hallstatt elite burials reveal is a social hierarchy that had sharpened considerably from what we see in much of the preceding period. Certain individuals were buried beneath large earthen mounds, accompanied by four-wheeled wagons, elaborate bronze vessels, imported goods from the Mediterranean world, and quantities of prestige objects that advertised their status unmistakably. The gap between these high-status burials and those of ordinary community members had grown wide. These were not simply respected warriors or successful farmers, they were something closer to princes, individuals whose power was expressed through conspicuous wealth, through the ability to accumulate and display objects that had travelled enormous distances to reach them. The landscape these elites inhabited was increasingly organised around hill forts, substantial defended settlements built on commanding high ground, their interiors containing evidence of craft production, storage, and what appear to be administrative or political functions. These were not simply refuges in times of danger. They were central places, nodes of authority and economic activity around which territories were organised. The rise of hill forts across the Hallstatt world reflects a stronger investment in territorial identity than we can easily trace in earlier periods. Communities were marking and defending space more explicitly, and the elites who controlled the hill forts were consolidating the relationship between power, place, and production in ways that look, cautiously, like early state formation. Mediterranean contact fed into this process in ways that were more than just the supply of luxury goods. By the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, Greek traders and colonists had established footholds along the southern French coast, Massalia, modern Marseille, being the most significant, while Phoenician and Etruscan networks were threading through the western Mediterranean and making contact with communities further north. What flowed northward along river routes like the Rhone and Rhine was wine, fine pottery, bronze vessels, and the cultural prestige associated with Mediterranean symposium culture. What flowed southward was probably primarily furs, slaves, amber, and raw materials. But the exchange was not simply economic. It carried ideas about how to display status, how to conduct elite sociality, how to organize feasting and hospitality in ways that signaled power. The famous crater from Vix in Burgundy, a massive bronze mixing vessel for wine, standing over 1.5 meters tall and of Greek manufacture, found in the burial of a woman of extraordinary status, is one of the most vivid illustrations of how deeply Mediterranean goods had penetrated Hallstatt elite culture by the late 6th century BCE. Objects like this did not travel passively. They traveled because someone wanted them, because they meant something within the social logic of the communities that acquired them, and because controlling access to them was itself a form of power. This is where the Iron Age reveals itself as something more than a technological episode. The adoption of iron, the emergence of hill fort-based territorial elites, the intensification of Mediterranean contact, the development of specialized craft production in everything from textiles to metalwork to fine ceramics. These were all facets of a social transformation that was reshaping how European communities were organized, who held power within them, and what that power meant. Craft specialization meant that not everyone could make everything. Some people were full-time smiths, weavers or potters, which implied both a surplus economy capable of supporting them and a degree of social differentiation that structured daily life in new ways. Political complexity was deepening, even if it remained well short of what we would recognize as states in the later historical sense. The networks connecting hill forts to surrounding agricultural communities, coordinating labor and tribute, mediating exchange and conflict, were genuine political structures, early, fragile, contested, but real. Chiefs or paramount leaders were accumulating the ability to direct collective resources in ways that had lasting effects on the landscape. The hill fort itself was a political statement as much as a defensive installation. It said that the community here was bounded, organized, and had someone at its center worth defending. The Iron Age across Central and Western Europe was building toward something. The societies taking shape in these centuries, more hierarchical, more territorially organized, more connected to Mediterranean currents of exchange and influence, and more capable of sustained production, would become the direct ancestors of the Celtic-speaking peoples that later Greek and Roman writers would encounter and describe. The story was not yet finished, but the chapter being written between roughly 800 and 500 BCE represents a hinge point. The moment when prehistoric Europe began assembling the pieces that would eventually catch the attention of literate Mediterranean observers, and in doing so, begin the slow transition towards something that we can actually read about. When Greek and Roman writers began describing the peoples living north and west of the Mediterranean world, they reached for a name, Keltoi or Celtae. It was a term applied broadly, sometimes loosely, to a vast swathe of Iron Age Europe, from the peoples of Gaul to the inhabitants of Britain, from the communities of Iberia to the tribal societies of Central Europe who had pushed as far as Anatolia by the 3rd century BCE. For modern scholars, this has created one of prehistory's most tangled interpretive problems. Were the Celts a coherent cultural group, an ethnic identity, a linguistic family, or simply a Roman-era label applied to everyone who looked and behaved in broadly similar ways from a Mediterranean perspective? The honest answer is that it was probably all of these things in different proportions at different times, and that no single definition satisfies all the evidence. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that a family of related languages, the Celtic languages, was spoken across wide areas of Europe by the last few centuries BCE, and that these languages carried genuine historical weight as evidence of shared deep roots. What we cannot say with anything like the same confidence is that all Celtic-speaking peoples constituted a single civilization with unified identity, shared political structures, or even a strong sense of mutual belonging. The Celts, insofar as they existed as a collective entity, were more like a family of cultures than a nation, connected by threads of language, artistic style, religious practice, and social organization, but deeply varied in their specific expressions of those connections. The thread that pulls this family of cultures into sharpest visual focus is what archaeologists call the Latin style. Named for a site on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where, around the turn of the 20th century, hundreds of weapons, tools and ornaments were recovered from what appears to have been a major votive deposit, Latin art is among the most distinctive artistic traditions in all of prehistoric Europe. Its hallmarks are curving organic forms, tendrils and spirals, abstract faces peering from the geometry, S-curves layered over each other in compositions that seem to pulse with movement. It appears on swords and scabbards, on bronze torques worn around the neck, on elaborately decorated helmets and shields. Elite metalwork in the Latin tradition was extraordinary by any standard, and the skill required to produce it was clearly the product of dedicated craft specialists working within patronage relationships that rewarded excellence and innovation. What Latin art shows us, though, is primarily the visibility of elite culture. The weapons buried with high-status warriors, the ornaments worn by those wealthy enough to commission fine metalwork, These objects survive and dazzle, but they can create a distorted impression. The vast majority of people living in Iron Age Europe left behind no lateen sword, no decorated torque, no ornate chariot fitting. Their lives were organized around agriculture, craft production, seasonal rhythms and local community in ways that shared the broad structural features of what had come before. The spectacular objects remind us of hierarchy and wealth. They do not fully represent the society that produced them. And that society was profoundly varied across geography. In Iberia, the pre-Roman Iron Age was not simply a Celtic world, it was a mosaic of Celtic-influenced communities in the north and west, Iberian-speaking societies in the east and south with their own rich artistic and urban traditions, Phoenician and later Carthaginian colonies along the southern coasts, and Greek trading settlements on the northeastern fringe. In Gaul, roughly modern France, dozens of distinct tribal peoples occupied territories that differed enormously in terrain, economy, and social organization. Britain's Iron Age societies developed their own regional variations, from the roundhouse-centred communities of the Scottish Highlands to the more intensively farmed and politically complex territories of southern England. And in Central Europe, from the Middle Danube to the edges of the Pontic steppe, the picture was equally fragmented. Germanic-speaking peoples, Celtic-speaking groups, and populations who defy easy linguistic categorization all occupied their own territorial niches in shifting configurations. Religion bound these societies together in important ways, even when specific practices varied. Sacred groves, called nemiton in Celtic languages, appear in the written record and are echoed in place names scattered across Europe from Britain to Galatia in modern Turkey. Sanctuaries, both natural and constructed, received offerings of weapons, jewelry, animals, and sometimes humans. The lateen deposit itself was almost certainly a ritual site of this kind. Classical sources, most famously Julius Caesar, describe Druids as a learned priestly class who presided over sacrifice, memorized vast bodies of oral knowledge, adjudicated legal disputes, and maintained the cosmological framework that gave these societies their shared mental world. But Caesar's account is shaped by political purpose and cultural condescension in equal measure, and archaeology can do little to directly confirm or contradict much of what he says. We can see the deposits, the sanctuaries, the evidence of ritual practice, but the beliefs, the stories, the theology behind them exist only in the most fragmentary and late form, filtered through hostile or distorted sources. That absence of direct textual evidence is a fundamental limit on everything we can say about prehistoric European religion and oral tradition. These were societies without writing, or rather, societies that used writing only for limited purposes. The Gauls had access to Greek-derived scripts, but used them mostly for commerce and record-keeping, not for preserving the traditions that structured their inner lives. The rich mythological inheritance of medieval Irish and Welsh literature carries echoes of a much older Celtic world. But how far those echoes reach back into prehistory, and how much has been transformed by the passage of centuries, is genuinely impossible to determine. Meanwhile, the pressure of Mediterranean expansion was building throughout these final centuries before the Common Era. Greek traders and colonists had long since established themselves on European coastlines. Carthaginian power shaped the western Mediterranean and Iberia. And from the late 2nd century BCE onward, Rome was expanding northward with an urgency that would eventually engulf nearly all of Western and Central Europe. For the indigenous societies of the Iron Age, this was not simply the arrival of a superior civilization. It was a collision between different political logics, different scales of organization, and different modes of power. Some communities sought alliance, integration, and the advantages that Roman connection could bring. Others resisted. Many were simply overwhelmed. What is worth holding on to, though, is how that collision found. Prehistoric Europe on the eve of Roman expansion was not a uniform world waiting to be enlightened. It was a patchwork of hundreds of distinct societies, each with its own territorial identity, its own social hierarchies, its own patterns of exchange and ritual, its own history stretching back through the Iron Age into the Bronze Age and beyond. The reason it remained a patchwork, rather than consolidating into unified civilizations, was partly geographic. Rivers, mountain ranges and forests created natural boundaries that encouraged local identity, but it was also a function of the social logic of these societies themselves. Power in Iron Age Europe was typically personal, competitive, fragile and local. It did not generate the administrative machinery needed to hold large territories together across generations. That is not a failure. It is simply what these societies were: complex, vital, diverse, and deeply human, right to the edge of the moment when someone finally started writing things down. And that moment, when someone finally started writing things down, is worth examining carefully, because it did not arrive everywhere at once, and it did not arrive as a clean break. For the Greek world, parts of Europe had been visible in written sources since at least the 6th century BCE. Hecataeus of Miletus sketched a geography of the known world that gestured toward distant northern and western peoples. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century, mentions the Celts and places them vaguely at the edges of his mental map, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, out toward the source of the Danube. Pythias of Massalia, a Greek navigator from what is now Marseille, ventured north sometime around 325 BCE and returned with descriptions of Britain, of a land called Thule somewhere at the northern limit of the world, of tides and frozen seas and peoples living at the edge of what the Mediterranean mind considered civilized space. His original account no longer survives. We know it only through later writers who quoted or criticized him, but even in fragments, it represents something genuinely new, first-hand Greek testimony about places that had previously existed only as rumor. What changes when written testimony joins archaeological evidence is significant, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Suddenly there are names of peoples, of leaders, of places. Suddenly we have at least some access to events, to political relationships, to how specific societies described themselves to outsiders or were described by them. The crossing of the Helvetii, the siege of Alesia, the resistance of Vercingetorix, these become anchored in time in a way that no burial assemblage or pollen core can fully replicate. The texture of history thickens, but that thickening comes with serious dangers, and historians and archaeologists have wrestled with them ever since. The writers who described prehistoric European societies were almost never neutral observers. Greek and Roman authors looked at the peoples north and west of the Mediterranean and saw, to varying degrees, barbarians, peoples defined primarily by their distance from urban, literate, politically organized civilization. This framing shaped everything: what was noticed, what was emphasized, what was dismissed. Caesar's account of Gaul is arguably the most detailed surviving description of any Iron Age European society, and it is also a document written by a military commander who was in the middle of conquering the people he described. His interest in accurate ethnography was always subordinate to his interest in justifying conquest, demonstrating Roman superiority, and advancing his own political career. Reading Caesar as transparent reportage on Gaulish society is like reading a colonial administrator's dispatches as transparent reportage on the colonized, useful, but requiring constant critical interrogation. Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Tacitus, each brought their own purposes and distortions. Tacitus, writing about Germanic peoples in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, was partly engaged in a pointed critique of what he saw as Roman moral decline. The noble simplicity he attributed to German tribes served his rhetorical purposes, whether or not it accurately reflected German social reality. The barbarian in these texts is often a mirror held up to reflect Roman anxieties back at Roman audiences. That does not make the accounts worthless, far from it, but it means that every piece of information they contain must be held alongside the question of why it was recorded in that particular way. What archaeology offers, persistently and valuably, is a counterweight to this textual distortion. Material evidence does not have political agendas. A roundhouse does not care whether its occupants were considered civilized. A bronze vessel used in feasting tells us something about social practice, regardless of how a Roman writer chose to characterize the people who used it. Increasingly, the most productive approach to the transition from prehistory to history is to use both streams of evidence, written and material, in genuine dialogue, letting each challenge and complicate the other, rather than defaulting to the assumption that writing automatically provides the more reliable picture. One of the most important things to recognize about this transition is that it happened at radically different times in different parts of Europe. Southern Gaul entered the written record earlier and more thoroughly than Britain. Britain was described in outline before it was conquered, but significant parts of Scotland were never fully absorbed into Roman administrative structures at all. Scandinavia, much of Central and Eastern Europe, and the far north remained outside literate observation for centuries after the Mediterranean fringe was already being written about in considerable detail. Ireland was never conquered by Rome and enters recorded history primarily through its own early medieval literary tradition, which is rich and extraordinary, but separated from the Iron Age by enough time that tracing exact continuities is deeply uncertain. This means that prehistory did not end at a single moment. It ended in layers, region by region, in ways that were determined by geography, by the expansion of literate imperial powers, and by the uneven adoption of writing within European societies themselves. When Julius Caesar arrived in Gaul in 58 BCE, the societies he encountered had already been in contact with the literate Mediterranean world for generations, through trade, through the movement of peoples, through the filter of Greek colonial neighbors. When Roman armies pushed into what is now Germany or Romania, they were entering worlds that had their own long histories of complexity and transformation, but worlds that had not yet been written about by anyone who left surviving records. And even after the written record begins, continuity with prehistoric traditions runs deep. Roman Gaul was not a blank slate onto which Roman civilization was inscribed. It was a layered society in which pre-Roman settlement patterns, religious practices, social structures and identities persisted, transformed by Roman contact, often expressed in new vocabularies of material culture, but genuinely continuous with what had come before. The same is true across Roman Europe. The temples built over Celtic sanctuaries, the persistence of local deities given Roman names, the survival of tribal identities within provincial administrative frameworks. History did not replace prehistory. It grew out of it, incompletely and unevenly, in ways that are still being traced. That is perhaps the most important thing to carry forward as we approach the edge of the prehistoric world. The boundary between prehistory and history is real in one sense. It marks the point at which written testimony becomes available, but it is artificial in another. The people on both sides of that boundary were the same people, living in the same landscapes, inheriting the same deep traditions. The difference is not that they changed. The difference is that we finally have more ways of hearing them. So let us step back and take in the full shape of what we have covered, because it is, when you hold it all together, a genuinely remarkable story. We began with a continent being discovered, not discovered by explorers arriving by ship, but by small groups of early humans pushing into an unfamiliar landmass over hundreds of thousands of years, testing its limits, retreating when glaciers made it uninhabitable, returning when the ice allowed. Europe was not a backdrop. It was an active participant, its climate shifting, its coasts moving, its forests expanding and contracting in rhythms that shaped every human decision made within it. Those earliest inhabitants were not primitive in any way that diminishes them. They were extraordinarily capable people operating in genuinely extreme conditions, and the fact that they survived at all is a testament to flexibility and intelligence we should not take for granted. Then came the Neanderthals, a human lineage that deserves to be released from the caricature that so long imprisoned it. They buried their dead, cared for the injured, made tools of considerable sophistication, and lived in Europe for a span of time so vast it dwarfs everything that came after them. When Homo sapiens arrived, the two populations met, and we know now from ancient DNA that they did not simply replace each other in clean succession. They mixed. Most people alive today carry a small but measurable inheritance from those encounters. Neanderthals did not vanish without trace. They are partly us. The arrival of modern humans opened a new chapter of cultural intensity, one visible in the extraordinary flowering of cave art, in portable sculpture, in the careful preparation of the dead, in evidence of long-distance exchange networks stretching across a frozen continent. These were not people scrambling to survive. These were people with rich inner lives, with cosmologies we can only glimpse through what they chose to paint and carve and bury. The Ice Age was not a long dark waiting room before real history began. It was, by any honest measure, a period of profound human achievement. The end of the ice brought transformation rather than simple improvement. Sea levels rose, landscapes reorganized, and the hunting cultures of the Paleolithic gave way to the more diverse, coastal and mobile world of the Mesolithic. And then, beginning roughly 10,000 years ago, farming arrived, not as a sudden gift, but as a slow, contested, complicated process of movement and adoption and resistance carried by people migrating from the Near East and gradually encountered by the hunter-gatherers who were already here. Europe's Neolithic was not a single phenomenon. It played out differently across different landscapes, at different speeds, with different outcomes. What followed was a recurring pattern, one you can see across the entire prehistoric arc. Periods of relative stability giving way to periods of transformation driven by some combination of climate pressure, new technology, population movement, and the restless human impulse toward contact and exchange. The megalith builders created monuments that have outlasted almost everything else our species has made in Europe. The beaker phenomenon spread a new set of material and possibly social practices across an enormous area in ways that genetics now tells us involved substantial population movement. The Bronze Age created the first genuinely continent-wide networks of trade, in which metals, objects and ideas circulated across distances that would have seemed extraordinary to any single community embedded within them. And then, in the late Bronze Age, something went wrong. Drought, system collapse, the failure of networks that had become too complex to sustain, and out of that disruption came the Iron Age with its new metallurgy, its warrior aristocracies, its regional cultural identities, and its eventual encounter with the literate Mediterranean world. Running through all of this are themes that appear again and again. Climate as a driver of change that no human intention could fully anticipate or resist, migration as a constant rather than an exception, innovation spreading through contact as much as through independent invention, belief systems of striking complexity shaping how communities organized space, time, death, and the cosmos, and exchange, always exchange, connecting people across distances and differences in ways that quietly undermined any notion that prehistoric Europe was ever a world of isolated tribes. What makes this story even more alive today is that it is still being written. Ancient DNA analysis has transformed our understanding of prehistoric population movements in ways that would have been science fiction 30 years ago. Isotope analysis tells us where individuals were born and where they traveled. LiDAR scanning reveals landscapes of monuments and settlements hidden beneath forest canopy. Residue analysis recovers the contents of vessels sealed for millennia. Each new method opens windows that were previously closed, and each window reveals not that we were right all along, but that the picture was more complicated, more dynamic, and more human than earlier models allowed. The story we can tell now is genuinely different from the story that could be told in 1980, and the story that will be told in 2060 will likely be different again. None of this is darkness. That is perhaps the most important thing to take away from all of it. Prehistory was named in contrast to history, defined by the absence of writing, but absence of writing is not absence of meaning, not absence of memory, not absence of the full range of human experience. The people who built Stonehenge and the people who sailed copper across the Baltic and the people who painted aurochs on cave walls by lamplight were not waiting for someone to invent the alphabet before their lives could matter. They lived, they remembered, they passed things forward. We are still finding out what they knew,